Hello. Welcome to week 7, lecture 7. Hard to believe as it may be. Last quarter, I guess you could say, of the class, last 2 weeks. Just wanted to remind you as well that next week, although in your other classes, the 16-week classes, you may not have class, our course runs through next week. So I'll be posting the final exam next week, but we'll also have around this time next Monday, May 3rd, I'll be posting a new mini lecture. So what are we looking at this week? Well, make sure you have your textbooks there handy and referring to those, and have a pen and paper or whatever your note-taking device is while I go through some of the important themes of chapter 29. I call it a cold war, to emphasize that cold theme, that this was an odd time, an odd type of war. It wasn't usually a hot war, meaning a traditional war fought between two powers on one battlefield or on many battlefields even, but a war where the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers that emerged after World War II in this new world order, never actually exchanged a shot with one another. Cold War refers to that steely, ice-cold relations between these two superpowers that tended to infect the entire world as they attempted to recruit otherwise non-allied nations to their side. Okay, so you look at chapter 29 and you see it begins actually with a talking about these non-aligned nations, or what would become known as the Third World. We still use this term Third World today, right? Although the term itself is kind of antiquated, it's kind of outdated. Because the term comes from the Cold War, when the world was a bipolar world, meaning two extreme sides, USA and USSR, communism, centralized control of economies versus free market economies and democracy. And one of the pivotal figures in the Cold War in the Third World was that female prime minister of a country that's recently and so tragically been in the news lately, Sri Lanka, and the female prime minister at this time, Mavo Bandaranaki. Noaki. It's very difficult to name to say in some ways, but look at it there. She's a prime minister of Sri Lanka. She's part of that third world that they weren't necessarily, can you imagine representatives from the CIA and the KGB showing up in your country wanting to know which side you're going to be on, and you're usually the response of non-aligned nations were something along the lines of, well, what are you doing here, and what can you do for us, right? For our country. So they often tried to play each of the superpowers off one another to get their own deal. And you can see there maps of the Cold War, map 29.1, where the world is divided up between these two camps. And the non-aligned world too, the third world, both sides are trying to recruit them. All of this comes out of the Bolshevik Revolution that we talked about in our last chapter during World War I, and the chaos that had occurred after World War I. That's one of the things that when the next World War ends and World War II ends, they want to avoid the mistakes that they had made after World War I. Remember when I used that term to describe what the world was like after World War I? Chaos, tumult. Well, after World War II, there's even more there's more refugees in the tens of millions in places like China and Korea and in Europe. Millions of refugees, homeless people, industries destroyed. The use of atom bombs in Japan on Hiroshima and Nagasaki these industrial giants of Germany and Japan leveled to the ground in many instances. And the response was, well, we have to stay involved. This was especially the response of the United States after World War II. Very different. After the World War I, the United States has basically packed up its bags in Europe and other places around the world and gone home. Even a president at the time in the 1920s ran on the platform of a return to normalcy. Well, there was no return to normalcy after World War II. In fact, it was a race almost to stay involved in the world and to match Soviet expansion in a policy that would become known as containment or the Truman Doctrine. This was how the United States decided to fight the Cold War, with containment. And you can think there's two other arguments on how to confront the Soviet Union at the time in the United States. There was a more extreme argument of militarism, to roll back the Soviet Union and even to make a direct attack on the Soviet Union, kind of preemptive attack, because the Soviet Union was deemed to be so destructive and such a global threat. And then there was another response amongst some people in power and politicians to take a very light hand against the Soviet Union, and that we should mind our own business and worry more about domestic policies and not get involved in a big global imperial conflict. Okay? So, but the policy decided on was containment. This would largely be the policy of the United States throughout the Cold War. It will become known as a Truman Doctrine, but Eisenhower, Kennedy, President Johnson, these later presidents during the Cold War mostly followed this policy of containment. Don't try to roll communist power back, but try to check it, try to contain it. And you see this being first put into play in 1948, 49, in the Berlin crisis, when the Soviet Union attempts to block off the city of Berlin, which it surrounded with its military. It had surrounded after World War II by its military. U.S. troops, French troops, British troops are all stationed in the western zone of Berlin, and the Soviet Union decides, well, one way we can get rid of this thorn in our side, which is U.S. troops right in the heart of Germany, is to cut off all land transportation into the city. So that's what they do. The U.S. responds with an airlift. Pretty impressive operation, actually. I would hope even a non-biased interpretation would say that this was pretty successful. It showed the U.S.'s commitment to using whatever resources it could, both to defend Germany and German democracy, and also to contain Soviet expansion. This would be the U.S. policy in Korea as well, when North Korea, just like Germany had been divided in zones of occupation after World War II, Korea also had been zoned off into a northern and southern district in that case. The northern district, of course, being the part where the Soviet Union had more of a hand in the reconstruction, where a communist dictatorship was put in place there. 1949 is such an important date in the Cold War, because you have all these things going on in that year. You have the crisis in Berlin and the Berlin airlift. Then you have the testing of the first nuclear weapon, atomic bomb, by the Soviet Union in 1949. And also you have Mao Zedong, a communist leader in China, successfully winning the civil war there in 1949 and proclaiming the People's Republic of China. And Taiwan will be the place in which the defeated side in the communist civil war, there in the civil war in China, where they will take up residence and where they still are today, right? Taiwan is still not part of the People's Republic of China. It's just offshore there, that very industrial island. This Cold War doesn't just occur then in Europe, although I often call Berlin ground zero in the Cold War because it's the only place in which US troops and Soviet troops were actually in the city of Berlin near the Brandenburg Gates, practically in stone's throw reach of one another, kind of eyeball to eyeball. But it expanded out from Europe and Washington and Moscow to all places around the globe, even into South America and Central America and the Caribbean, shocking everyone in 1959 with Fidel Castro's successful communist revolution there. So this was a global conflict. I called it a bipolar world, or lots of people call it that. And the question for a lot of strategists in Moscow and Washington as they're waging the Cold War is where to intervene directly, if at all. Obviously, the U.S. made calculations under President Truman to intervene in Korea. That ends in a stalemate in 1953, after about 4 years of bloody, almost trench warfare there. The battles in Korea look almost more like World War I than World War II because of the amount of trench warfare, these big grinding infantry attacks that took the lives of so many people, Koreans, Americans, Chinese, as well, especially when Mao Zedong intervenes directly on the side of North Korea in the Korean War. That ends in a stalemate with an armistice or a ceasefire in 1953. But there's no real agreement, right? And to this day, that border is one of the most militarized borders in the world. Meanwhile, you have Fidel Castro as well by 1959, assuming power and control then. You have the CIA active across the third world, trying to recruit people for its side, or oftentimes playing a kind of defensive roles in trying to organize anti-communist groups, because communism had quite an appeal for landless peasants around the world. The majority of people in the world in the 1950s and 1960s, up until just recently, have been rural people living in undeveloped nations. So this is where often the Cold War, if it ever became hot, this is where it happened, in those countries such as then Vietnam in the 1960s, and also in Afghanistan for the Soviet Union in the 1980s, later in the Cold War. So these things are also hinged upon the new types of weapons used in the on the Cold War. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union developed its first intercontinental ballistic missile. You can read about that, with a range of 3,000 miles, making it in range of targets like Washington, D.C. and the east coast of the United States, right? This also probably the most dangerous time during the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis there in 1962. The blockade, you can look at a map there, excuse me, on 29.3, map 29.3. That's the closest the U.S. and the Soviet Union ever came to armed confrontation. The Soviet fleet was actually sailing towards Cuba with orders to deliver, to sail into Havana Harbor. When just within a few miles of each other, orders come from the Kremlin telling the captain there to turn back. We know a lot more about the Cuban Missile Crisis today as well, because of White House tapes that in the last 10 or 15 years have been opened up. So if you ever want to learn more about a fascinating time in the Cold War, that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. That ends in a nuclear test ban treaty, though, also when Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and the new president, the young president, John F. Kennedy, signed that nuclear test. And there's actually a secret swap that goes on that ended the Cuban crisis. The U.S. said, we'll pull our nuclear weapons out of Turkey, which is close to your borders. Speaking to the Soviet Union, they were saying, and the Soviet Union in exchange said, okay, and we'll grudgingly pull our missiles out of Cuba. Okay, so look at those sections. Also important during this time after World War II is I said earlier that the U.S. had decided to stay more involved in in world affairs after World War II. You see this with the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization between Western European democracies and the United States and Canada. So this transatlantic relationship and commitment to Western democracies' security against communism. The Soviet Union counters with their creation of Eastern Bloc European countries and an alliance there called the Warsaw Pact, which included all those communist countries in Eastern Europe. And real different cultures began to evolve after World War II in Eastern Bloc countries, communist countries, and Western countries. Western countries, or should we say democratic countries, because we also include here Japan as well, develop cultures of mass consumption, with the exporting of American products around the world, such as Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola, and eventually McDonald's, and all these brands. And there's this baby boom in the United States that's fueling the consumption. Everyone's ideal now is to take out a big mortgage and buy a house and work 9 to 5 and make enough so your spouse or wife stays at home. This was a sort of 1950s baby boom ideal that we see. And also, though, a vibrancy in culture as well, though, beyond the consent. A lot of the artwork at this time actually, as you'll see, involves a rejecting of the materialism of mass consumption and focusing instead on more existentialist ideas about what is truly important in living an authentic life. That's the pushback as well. The vibrancy, I think, as well, comes from the civil rights movement after World War II in the United States. This idea that there was such a stark contrast between the aims of the goal of the World War II of defeating fascism, and then black soldiers, African American soldiers particularly, returning home to a segregated society, fighting to eradicate fascism from the world and that extreme ethnic nationalism, only to find themselves riding in the back of the bus or on separate train cars when they were coming back to their homelands. So this spurs on the civil rights movement, and also inspires a lot of political dissidence, political resistance under communism as well. I think in some respects, the American civil rights movement effect upon resistance in the communist world in the Cold War is kind of underappreciated. And of course, there had been Mahatma Gandhi during World War II and the movement towards decolonization. That's the other big theme. I'm going to leave you here with this lecture with just reminding you that one of the things also fueling the Cold War was the rush in the Third World to try and capture this spirit of decolonization. All those empires that we've been studying for the last couple of weeks that had been built up around the globe, now, for practical reasons and for ethical and moral and political reasons, are no longer sustainable. So the British Empire in Africa, the French Empire, there's all this withdrawal. But what's going to happen in that power vacuum? That's when the Soviet Union attempts to rush in and say that communist parties are the most effective guarantors of your political and ethnic independence from big empires. It's kind of ironic, though, because the Soviet Union is itself a big empire and is pretty imperialistic about exporting its own version of what communism should look like. Okay, so that gives you a lot to study this week. Thank you for listening, and I will see you all week 8 in our final and concluding lecture on the fall of communism.
Pause video recording button.